places in the world, and our two presenters are actually in the Netherlands and in Germany, where it's afternoon. We're excited for another day. We had a really great first day of the policing conference yesterday, and today we have 3 more panels. Jan and Laura are going to be our first presenters today. Unfortunately, Sarah Brayne cannot join us today, but we're hoping that you're staying with us anyways if you came to see her presentation. Our first presenter today is going to be Jan Beek from the University of Mainz. So with that, Jan, I will give it over to you. And just like yesterday, if you do have, we are going to collect all the questions until the end of the panel. And if you have questions on YouTube, ask them directly on YouTube, and we will be asking them to our presenters for you. So Jan, you will have the floor. Thank you.
Morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sandra and Jeff, for inviting me for this amazing conference. I will now try to share my screen. Okay, I hope this works for everyone. Some months ago, I did fieldwork in a German police station, and the police officers there had just put a Romanian into an arrest cell, and it had been kind of difficult. And then immediately afterwards, I talked to Sergeant Sarah about the offender and about the difficulties of putting him into the cells, and she told me these, like the utterances of the person they had put into the cells, these are typical PGE lies. You know, for us, they are still zigos. And to explain some words, PGE is an acronym police officers in German use. It means personengemäß Erlass, which roughly translates as persons pursuant to the decree. And what this actually means, I will explain in the middle of my presentation. And Zigos is an abbreviation for Zigeuner, or which roughly translates as gypsies. And of course, gypsy is an ethnic slur for Romani and for other groups in Germany. And as a disclaimer, I put a lot of quotation marks here to kind of convey to you that I use these terms as emic categories, meaning these are the categories that the police officers use to understand people, to categorize people. And these are, I don't use these categories as analytical categories, as because the people who are designated with these terms totally refute them and use other terms to describe themselves. In my presentation, I want to use this remark as a starting point to explore how German police officers employed and employ various emic categories of difference and how these relate to legal outcomes. My presentation is based on fieldwork in 2 German police stations. Fieldwork took 4 months in total, mostly participant observation. And these both police stations were in larger cities in the middle of Germany. In my presentation, I first want to explain my conceptual framework. What do I mean when I speak of police work as a practice of differentiation? Then I want to explore how the German police historically used the category Zigeuner and other ones, and I want to show that it's a resilient category. And then in my third part, I want to complicate things, because I want to ask how this is not only a racializing category, but can also be understood in the context of their work. I'm coming to the first part. What do I mean by police work as doing differences? When I speak of the categories of race, ethnicity, culture, but also age, class, and so on, I don't use these categories as analytic, as fixed categories, but as emic ones, as the ones that actors use. I'm kind of following Brubaker, and I quote him here, ethnicity, race, and nationhood are fundamentally ways of perceiving, interpreting, and representing the social world. And understand these terms as productive in the sense that they create differences that they seem only to describe. And if you using this term, you can understand police work as actually the task of differentiating people according to rules and work-related routines. Police work, seen generally, can be understood as that police officers sort actors according to the dominant social categories of difference in their society. For instance, age, nationality, gender, occupation, and so on. And some of these categories are linked with the legal categories, other are kind of intertwined with normative understandings, and some are what Gautier calls underground categories, specifically class, gender, ethnicity, culture, and race. These categories are in European societies forbidden by law and morally disapproved, because all state organizations say that they uphold the principle of equality before the law. And understand these categories as situational, productive, and that they can be made relevant or not made relevant in specific interactions. They can be brought up, or they cannot be brought up, which I talk about, like, can be seen as a doing and undoing of certain differences. Now, I want to look at the history of how a certain difference was produced and enacted. The racializing term Zigeuner. As you probably all know, the Nazi regime in Germany persecuted and killed millions of people who they categorized as Zigeuner. And after the genocide in the Second World War, the police didn't stop to use the term, but still used it. They produced official lists of these people. They wrote criminological research, which used the categorization of like specific crimes that were attributed to these people, etc. But this changed in the 1980s because of political changes, and then the police management leadership banned these terms in official police language. But the police then started to use alternative terms. They used the term Landfahrer, which roughly translates as traveler. They used the term HWAO, which kind of means frequently changing residence. So instead of the old term, they used new ones. And then in the 80s, in the 90s, there was more pressure especially from NGOs. And then they also began to ban these terms, these new alternative terms. And then the police officers came up with another term. They started to call them MEM, short for Mobile Ethnic Minority. And when I did my first police research in 2011, what they often MEM also had become a difficult word, and they started to just say Romanians and Bulgarians, and they said it with a certain emphasis so that everybody knew that whom they actually meant. And they also bitterly complained about these restrictions of their internal language, which is kind of very much in line with what David Sauster yesterday discussed under the term the last policeman. And then now we come to the term PGE or PGE. In the early 2010s, in a specific state, the police headquarters issued a decree explicitly forbidding to use any of these terms. And therefore, the police officers invented a new term. They the term PGE, personengemäß Erlass. And it means I'm now talking about the people that I'm not allowed to label. And it's kind of a fascinating use of language, because you categorize people by referring to the fact that you're no longer allowed to categorize them. And of course, nowadays, this term is also no longer allowed. And looking at the whole history, it's kind of interesting, because you see that there is quite a resilience of this racializing category, and you see a transformation from explicit to more explicit forms of explicit terms to more underground categories. And this resilience is especially noteworthy because nowadays it has become a dangerous category. police officers are unsure how to use it internally because it can be dangerous for your career, because your police management and senior police officers don't like to hear these terms. And the history of this ethnic label can be read as an enduring organizational racism, because all these terms implicitly allege criminality, they essentialize ethnic difference, and they also allege mobility, meaning these people really don't belong here, they're always coming from somewhere else. However, now I want to complicate the issue by exploring a specific interaction to show that the actual use of the category is often highly ambivalent, flexible, and has no real impact on the eventual outcome of police intervention. I come to, here in this, my third part, I want to ask, how is the category situationally applied in everyday work? And are there rationalities for the continued use of this category besides organizational racism? And for this, I want to tell you the whole interaction that took place that led to the quote that I brought in the beginning. Some months ago, I followed two police officers, a seasoned female police officer and a middle-aged police officer. A local court had issued a warrant for the arrest of a man called Marco. Marco is a Romanian citizen, and the warrant was issued because he had not paid a court-mandated penalty for a stealing offense. For the police, this is a very mundane task. The citizen has to come up with the money, in this case 700 euros, or he goes to jail. And in this case, the police officers drove to the apartment, a building near the city center. It was a huge apartment building. The front door of the whole building, they picked the door, and then they went direct to the second floor, rang the bell directly in front of the apartment. A small girl opened, and she was Marco's daughter, and Marco came later. He is a 40 years old man. He has a very old face, and he was constantly smoking for the whole time we were there. He always had a cigarette. He spoke a little bit of German, but soon his teenage son came and began translating for him. And the police officers explained why they were here. And he then claimed that he had just paid the court some days ago. Then the police officers checked his receipt, and it became clear that he had paid for another stealing offense he had committed, that all in all, he had 5 penalties for various offenses. And the police officer then gave him the opportunity to call his friends to come up with the 700 euros. And this took like 10, 15 minutes, a long time, 10 cigarettes, I would guess. And but in the end, he didn't manage to get the full amount. And then he tried to negotiate whether it would be possible to pay only 500 euros, but the police officers refused. Then Marco fell on his knees and pleaded with the police officers, and they were visibly embarrassed, but they did not relent. And finally, it became clear that Marco could not pay the money, and they told him that he had to come with them. They decided not to handcuff him and drove him to the police station. And at the police station, they immediately took him to the cells. And then the whole situation changed slightly. He was clearly taken aback. He then explained that he couldn't go into the cells. It was impossible for him because of his medical condition, because he needed another smoke, because he needed something to drink, because he needed to make one more phone call. And all of this with a lot of explaining, a lot of swearing, and pleading with the officers. And the situation became more and more tense. But in the end, the police officers gave him a cup of water, and they offered him to let him out 20 minutes later to do another phone call. And he finally accepted and went in. And after this situation, I talked to Sergeant Sarah, and she gave the statements about typical PGE lies that I started with. However, the whole situation was soon resolved. Marco's mother came. She had 700 euros. Police officers did the paperwork. Marco was allowed outside, smoked a cigarette, and soon after was released. And when we ask what categories did the police officers employ in this interaction, it's quite interesting what kind of various categories were brought up and how they relate to each other. First, you have categories of culture, ethnicity, race. what you're talking about, like this label PGE and this label SIGO. And this was kind of a potential category because of Marco's Romanian citizenship. But it's interesting to look at when it was brought up. It was not brought up when the police officers learned about his kind of crime, about his nationality, about his language, or about his clothes, but it was based on his behavior towards the police officers, especially during the process of transferring him into the cells. And actually, I have often observed that police officers use these terms, PGE and SIGO, for people who are difficult to deal with in a certain kind of way. And it's kind of similar, a little bit similar, or comparable to the category asshole that Van Maan has discussed in his paper. And it's a kind of work-related category. It's useful for them because it's a heuristic form of knowledge production. With one term, they can inform each other what to expect, what to do. And I think this is also a reason for this concept's resilience, where they never gave it up. But it's also, if you look at the everyday use, highly fluid and situational. When I openly asked the policeman later whether or not Marco was a PGE, he told me, perhaps, but he was a borderline case. At least he was polite. He made an effort. I was not sure about him. So in the end, it could also be seen as an undoing of the category of culture, ethnicity, and race in the end. It's also interesting to note what categories were not brought up. Like they didn't bring up the migrant status or class. These were never made relevant, never talked about. Then there are also moral categories. The police officer used their discretion to give him time, Marco time, because he was, in their eyes, not a legitimate target of full-on police intervention. For them, he was a small-time criminal, not violent, not dangerous, therefore not of particular interest to them. And they also decided not to handcuff him, which is actually more or less official policy, because they didn't want to embarrass him in front of his family because he was a father. And there are also legal operational categories that kind of, that were in effect the most important ones. Like Marco was the subject of an arrest warrant, and that was the reason for the whole interaction. And this legal category implies professional routines. And for police officers, if they have to send someone from the cells to jail, it takes a long time and is very boring police work, and this is not what they want to do. Therefore, they much prefer to just collect the money. And they actually tried everything not to execute the arrest warrant. And if you look at the whole interaction, the ethnic categorization was neither conclusive, nor did it determine the outcome in the end. Then I come to my conclusion. In my presentation, I tried to bring together a long history of a specific category of difference, but also the rationality and logics of police work and the complex intersections between both. And the history of the specific ethnic label can be told as a story of a resilient racializing category. And it can be told as the history of organizational racism, how people did and do racial difference. And you can also see the change from explicit to covert forms, and kind of a story of a failed transformation and failed change, I would say. But the ethnographic material, interestingly, allows a kind of different reading, because it points to the situational and highly dynamic use of these categories. For police officers, the ethnic lens is useful and is more, helps them as a work-related category. And it also does not always impact the outcome of the interaction. And it's interesting that cultural, ethnic, and racial differences are often not emphasized in police-citizen interactions in Germany. In most of them, they don't play a role. And it kind of points to the fact that this category is only one among many. And therefore, I want to kind of end with a question, because then it gets really interesting how the specific categories are evoked, how they affect the result of the interaction. And instead of focusing on one category, I think it's important to study how these various differences relate to each other, how they are intertwined, how they are brought up, in speech, and that you also need an awareness of the bureaucratic, legal, and normative rationalities of police work. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jan. This was super interesting. Being German myself, I found this especially interesting. So I have lots of questions for you myself for later. But yeah, thank you for your presentation. And with that, I will announce our second speaker, Laura Keesman. I know no, I did not say your name correctly, from the University of Amsterdam. And we are looking forward to your presentation. And what I didn't say beforehand, there are questions popping in the chat. Just try to ignore it. We will take it all later. Okay, Laura, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Let's see if it works. Just give me a second because it's not popping up. Let's see if this works. Just a second. Can you see this?
Yes.
You see the PowerPoint, correct?
Yes, yeah. Yes, we do.
Okay, great, great. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you, Sandra, for leading this panel and everyone joining in so early in the morning in Canada and a bit easier times, hopefully, for the rest of us here. So I'm really excited to talk about my research into violence in the Dutch police organization. As mentioned by Sandra, I work at the University of Amsterdam, Department of Sociology, where I'm part of the Group Violence Research Project. And I've previously studied social workers' experiences with violence, and I was actually a social worker myself for about 7 years in a homeless shelter in the red light district of Amsterdam. So violence is a bit of my thing. But today I would like to talk to you about how police officers read bodies, how they generate collective action, and the risk of freezing in the face of violence. So police actions and procedures are increasingly called into question, especially violence and use of force is receiving intense scrutiny all over the world. On the other hand, there's a lot of scholarship on victimization of officers, their daily emotional labor, and occupational stress. Also a lot of literature on the consequences of experiencing violence. Officer decision-making processes to experiencing violence, and thus the risk of having to deal with it. Now, my research focuses on the emotional and situational dynamics of violence interactions itself. Let me try if I can do this, actually. That works. Of violence interactions itself. And I conducted an ethnographic study of policing in the Netherlands between 2017 and 2021. I went along during regular shifts, ride-alongs, trainings, meals, office work, all in various police teams, and I interviewed a lot of officers about specific violent events. Now, I'm particularly interested in how officers mutually align during tense and/or violent interactions and work together, how they make attempts to gain control, how they generate lines of action, and how they manage their own bodies when confronted with tense dynamics. Importantly, I want to move away from police culture as a determinant in violent interactions and really focus on officers' collective achievement. So theoretically, I rely on Randall Collins's microsociological theory of violence in the sense that I start my analysis at the situation. So focusing on the emotional and situational dynamics of violent interactions. And in this way, I hope to make visible the physical aspects of police work, their doings with the body and their actions. So I wonder first, how do police officers mutually align during tense and violent interactions? And in there, there's also the question of how do officers understand one another situationally? Second, how do they collectively generate lines of action? And third, how do officers experience and give meaning to violent interactions, physically, emotionally, and mentally? Now, today, I will show you some results to these questions in the form of 2 papers, and so 2 parts of this presentation in which I discuss how officers generate action and experience violence in terms of freezing. So the first result I want to share with you is about generating or organizing collective action. I wondered, how do officers know when and how to engage in action? When do you know that you need to step in or stick a hand out to help your colleague? And how do officers do this in tense situations or in the face of violence? Now, in order to take action, officers continuously read bodies. So previous research has shown that they look at position, how one understands, they look at gestures, sounds, and facial expressions. And they do this to gain a sense of whether someone is emotionally aroused, what this person's intent is, and if there is a threat. In short, whether violence is imminent. And Johnson calls these aggressive interpersonal social cues. So officers are weighing and thinking, what is going to happen? What is this person going to do based on bodily cues also? Other examples are putting hands in pockets or blinking rapidly and tense muscles, which are all signs. Now, based on my study, I want to argue that there is more to just reading bodies. However, in research and scholarly literature, there's quite a disparity between talk and action. So forms of police culture are predominantly studied through ethnographies and interviews to arrive at the recreation of meanings and experiences. But interview studies generally lack systematic observational analysis of bodily action and thus prohibit showing sequences in that sense. Recently, other researchers have introduced video analysis to understand the situational dynamics of police work, but video analysis lack social meanings and officers' lived experiences, for instance, because videos lack sound and information of the people who are involved. Now, what I've tried to do, or to solve this problem and thus bring talk and action closer together, I watched videos of violent incidents together with officers who were recorded in these videos. So using videos as a tool to talk about their embodied know-how. So officers that I interviewed and got to know through fieldwork were recorded in violent incidents in various video sources, such as CCTV, but also body-worn cameras, bystander video. As I had with them, we would watch these videos and I continuously ask them how questions. So how are you using your body to do that, for instance? They really gain a sense of their embodied knowledge. So video elicitation helped officers to verbalize their shared bodily know-how of how to and when to do things, also because they reflected on the behaviors of their interaction partner. So just to give you an idea of what kind of video I watched with an officer, I would just give you one example, which is this video. Okay, so this video is a bit shaky, but still I want to show you an example of why watching videos yields substantial insight. So I will draw from an example that is not regarding this video, but another. But it is about an officer that is confronted with an aggressive and possibly psychotic individual that yells at him, clenches his fists, and threatens to resist arrest. And he reflects on the exact moment to initiate cuffing. So the officer says, here, I know we're going to cuff him. You just know that, you're trained in this. This was really the moment. Now we're going to cuff him, at least try to. So I ask him, how do you know this? And again, he says, I just felt it. Maybe because someone reached for their cuffs, but that would be too early. I don't know. It was just because he was standing like that. He was turned facing a wall. There was the opportunity to cuff him. And then he turns again to the video saying, yes, here, pointing at the screen, my colleague grabs his cuffs. Now, how can we analyze this? How does he just know this? And what does it tell about generating action and embodied know-how? So to analyze this, I rely on ethnomethodology to study these in people. So Garfinkel, for instance, notes that people use the actions of others as a resource to develop another line of action, and that is how people mutually align. And Schutzky argues that body acts and positions carry meanings that signify the next move. Now, this is crucial here. So officers, certain actions, positions, and gestures carry meanings that help to determine the next move, even though this next move is sometimes not verbally articulated. So now if we go back to that same quote, the generating action is about two things. The just knowing is about the position of the suspect, turned facing a wall, so with his back towards the officers, and the reach of his colleague towards his cuffs. And these occurrences project or signify the next move. That is, now this officer knows he needs to literally step in with his feet and extend his hand to grab the suspect. So even though officers do not always tell each other what they're about to do or what the next move is, they know when to do something because certain positions and gestures, eye contact, signify what the next move is. So in conclusion, officers not only read bodies to interpret behavior, but do this to generate the next move. So knowing what to do, for example, when to step in and grab hold of a suspect, exists in these action sequences in responding sensibly to what others are doing, specifically by reading signals, very much signals that come from the body. And of course, training helps to do this, right? The training helps to learn this, but still these signals are very important. So more generally, ethnomethodology applied to my data shows the accomplishment of interaction sequences. And this relates also to Goodwin's argument that situations are an indexical operation that we constantly are trying to fit together. Now, finally, this means that bodily know-how plays an important role in collective co-creation situations, and that police-civilian encounters are embodied. So bodily understanding and action project prospective action. And I think this should receive much more attention. So these findings on how officers understand one another situationally and how signifying channels the flow of action are published in my paper, where these topics of signals and bodily gaze, embodied know-how, and skill all return. And in the paper, I also discuss some limitations of video elicitation, such as the quality of videos may hamper discussions, ethical concerns, such as how to deal with the misuse of power or prejudice or excessive use of force if recorded. So I have limited time to discuss all these limitations and merits, but they are in the paper. Now, while this seems fairly straightforward, there are, of course, many instances when officers aren't mutually understand one another situationally or do not read behavior correctly. And of course, reading bodies is also biased in terms of certain groups of people being stopped and checked more often than others. And this relates somewhat to the risk of freezing, the second part of this presentation. So when confronted with violent incidents, police officers are expected to act in the situation at hand. In fact, in an attempt to take control of tense situations, officers often demand others to freeze, that is, immediately stop what they are doing. So freezing others is distinctive about the police officer's job. At the same time, they themselves have to keep acting. So we are all familiar with officers yelling freeze, especially in police films, but I wondered what happens when officers themselves freeze. So my aim was to explore what the term freezing and other metaphors that officers use refer to, what kind of behaviors, what they have in common, and why it works to lump these descriptions together. And then I studied the experience of freezing from a phenomenological and embodied viewpoint to understand the ways in which officers try to deal with it. So first, I build on existing neurobiological insights. Everyone surely knows the freeze, fight, flight response. And in the neurological sciences, freezing is considered a defensive reaction that is commonly activated through a threat associated with autonomic nervous systems that mobilize the body for survival. So freeze is mainly regarded as a defensive response, as a reaction to threat, and seen as facilitating action preparation. But officers indicate that freezing is not only paralyzing, but also causes irrational and panicky behaviors. So they view personal freezing or doing nothing as crippling and do not experience their own freezing as preparing for action or a decision stage, but rather as a debilitating event. So how can we better understand and analyze these experiences? Well, to bridge the disparity between neurological findings derived mostly from animal research and lab settings, which do not capture the situative character of freezing on the one hand, and actual experiences and stories of freezing on the other, I invoke literature on emotional corporal transformations. And why I do this becomes clear when we take a look at what happens when freezing. So as mentioned, one example of freezing is doing nothing. In other words, the deer in the headlights. So standing still, like being nailed to the ground, or another officer saying, my legs just did not want to move forward anymore. On the other hand, officers argue that freezing entails irrational behaviors, such as grabbing things that are unnecessary or not relevant to the situation or not acting appropriate. To the situations, this notion. So in general, officers argue that you cannot reach someone anymore. You can't get in touch with or gain contact with them anymore. People are caught up in their own world, cannot get a grip on themselves, and have lost control. That person isn't there in that moment. It seems as if someone is not present anymore in the here and now. And this losing presence with the world is exactly what phenomenologists write about. So I used phenomenological insights and theories on emotional corporal transformations as heuristic tools to understand the experience better. So for example, Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Cutts, and Schutz all write that normally people are integrated with their environment. Your body does what you want it to do. And you can direct yourself. So you take this embodied being and embodied being in the world for granted. However, in situations of overwhelming emotional arousal, for example, when you experience intense shame or when you feel sick, people's taken for granted incorporation is broken. And according to Katz, this brokenness is sensed corporally. So you are confronted with your body and you fall out of this taken for grantedness, out of your intertwinement with the environment. Now, exactly this relates to quotes of officers like, that person isn't here, he or she is in another world, she has lost connection with the here and now. So in a phenomenological sense, freezing is an emotional corporal transformation characterized by bodily foregrounding. Officers taken for granted intertwinement with the world is broken. So freezing is a self-enclosing process. Additionally, it is fruitful to know when is it most likely to happen. Well, it turns out it happens when situations completely change or when expectations about what kind of situation an officer may encounter suddenly shifts. For instance, when officers expect to go towards a domestic violence situation and then be confronted with multiple people that are trained fighters and angry and heated and not happy about the police showing up. It also happens when officers experience intense fear and when officers do not know what to do next or what their next move is, their so-called what now moment. And in those moments, officers do not know what their next move to make is, and they sometimes freeze. And to give you an example of a freezing experience, Officer Eddie discusses that his buddy experienced a freezing moment when he was confronted with an angry group of people starting to fight. So the situation was so pressing and threatening that his colleague locked himself in the police car. So he says, and then you turn around and someone behind you has a freezing moment. And at that freezing moment, my colleague literally pressed the buttons of the car downwards. And then you're standing there alone on the street, but I could also not get into the car anymore. And you hope that that pole starts calling with like another unit, but he was so frozen, he couldn't do it. Communication, everything was gone. It was just one big stress field. It's like someone internally screams like, no, 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 not again, not this, no more, done, stop. But then you're already too late. So here again, it's interesting that this officer is not standing still, but purposefully doing something, that is locking himself into the car to kind of lock himself out or remove himself from the ongoing situation. But freezing is, of course, not endless. Officers need to exit this transformation and return to normalcy of being integrated with their environment. Now, how do they do this? Well, first, they do this by receiving external stimuli. So officers often say they have to wake each other up by touching the freezing person, by calling or shouting their name, making eye contact, but also trying to focus on breathing and trying to talk to oneself internally. In general, though, in most freezing cases, you need others to regain contact with your environment, to be there again. And this also says something about the amount of teamwork that is inherent to policing. Now, via training, officers are also taught to visualize situations, that is, imagine them before they get there to not become surprised or startled. So they also mention muscle responses can then work to prepare for what's coming. But another important aspect that I want to bring out is that officers describe freezing experiences often in terms of shame. And that's really interesting because many officers think that others disapprove of it while they themselves find it quite understandable. However, it turns out that most officers also think it's understandable, so they actually think the same. And in social psychology, they call this pluralistic ignorance. So the mistaken belief that you feel differently about an attitude or behavior in comparison to your peers, when actually your peers think very much alike. So while officers think others disapprove of freezing while they find it okay, other officers also think it's okay. And this says something about the stigma that is still attached to freezing. So I discussed this new framing of freezing in my paper that says less biology and more sociology. Freezing is an emotional corporal transformation, a loss of connection or disruption even with the taken for granted intertwinement. So officers turn into their own world, lose their connection with the here and now, and are thrown out of a bodily latent, taken for granted intertwinement. It is a self-enclosing transformation and is not just characterized by bodily cessation, as the neurological sciences suggest, but also directionless behaviors. It occurs when officers encounter unexpected circumstances, when experiencing fear, surprise, not knowing the next step. Returning to normalcy requires teamwork with policing, and then training is beneficial to stay intertwined. And with this analysis, we know a bit more about the stress coping and the stigma of freezing. So to conclude, it would be good to think about how this knowledge may add to discussions about police scrutiny and police strategies and policies, as well as legitimacy and stress theories. I'm working on how a different conceptualization of freezing may contribute to training practices and police professionalization processes. And we may also ask how this knowledge is valuable to other professions that deal with violence and social control, so ambulance staff, social workers, firefighters. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on these findings and how you think it would be applicable more broadly. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I've given you some insights in my research.
Thank you so much. Two super fascinating presentations. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A. As I had announced in the beginning of the panel, Sarah is not able to join us today. So we're just having two presentations and therefore can take hopefully all the questions, though there have been many that have come in. I'm just going to start off with the first question to Jan, which is more a legal question. And Tom is asking that when it comes to the Roma peoples, I understand they have EU passports, but a quick Google search says it's hard for them to get papers for the country they live in. I was wondering if you're aware how they get EU passports if they do not have a German or a French passport, for example.
First, if I may, a short comment to Laura. Fascinating talk, by the way, and I really liked your phenomenological approach. It really resonates with my material and my experience as well. But when I thought about one thing, because I spoke to some police officers and who talked. Who explained to me that they often try to influence the other officer who is more or less very aggressive, and they try to influence him to go calmly into a situation. And it's exactly because of what you are describing, because normally, like, if both are aggressive, they kind of mutually align. And then they get into a track where one officer has to be more aggressive than he actually wants to. But you can't stop this in this situation because of this mutual alignment. But you have to do it up front, which I find kind of fascinating and really works with you. But to the question of Tom, sorry. For policing, it doesn't, like, if somebody has a European passport, and most of the Romani that the police deal with are either from Germany or from Romania or from Bulgaria. For them, if they have a EU passport, they are more or less treated like German citizens. It doesn't make a lot of difference in Germany. I know that in France, it's quite different. In France, the French police is actually deporting people with a EU citizenship from France back to Bulgaria and to Romania, and Frabiescu wrote some really interesting papers on this. But in Germany, there's not a lot of difference whether you are a German citizen or EU citizen.
Okay.
Answer the question.
I think so. I think he was also wondering how they. No, it wasn't about how they get the passports. No, I think it answered the question. Yeah. Okay, Laura, I'm going to, I have a question from Ashley for you. No, it's not from Ashley. It's from a class that is watching the presentation on YouTube. So Professor
Very
Dr.
cool.
Kemper, Dr. Kemper is making his class watch the discussion today, which is awesome. And so the students are wondering about your research methods. Analyzing video must be easier in Europe, where CCTV is ubiquitous. Is your analysis of movements and reactions more qualitative or coded in a quantitative fashion? So the methods question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So for me, it's more qualitative. So really using the videos as a tool to encourage officers to talk about what they are actually doing. And I'm doing this also because it's sometimes very difficult for officers to reflect on bodily behaviors. And when they are confronted with their own bodies, actually seeing them doing and acting, then it's a better way of encouraging them to talk about, so why are you doing this? How are you doing that? Instead of just reflecting it in a discursive way in regular interviews, it really adds another dimension and attempt for them to explicate what they are doing. And in terms of quantitative fashion, so there's a lot of rules in terms of what videos are suitable for quantitative analysis. And so if I would want to code behaviors, I'm actually working with other scholars that are trying to do this and do this with regards to CCTV, for instance. The big data sets where they have, say, 100 videos that they could code, usually what is left is about 30 or 20 good videos that you were even that allow you to code the behaviors, because the behaviors are explicit enough for you to code them. And I also used body-worn camera footage, which is also a bit shaky often, or bystander videos, just the videos that I showed you moves around too much so that it becomes really difficult to do it in a quantitative fashion. So I focused on the qualitative part.
And when you say that some videos are not suitable for quantitative coding, you mean because the scenes are not clear enough, they're not explicit enough, so that you can actually code them? Is that what you are referring to?
Yeah. So you need to be you need to be able to see a big chunk of the interaction. When it's too dark, you can't really see what's going on. So there's all these little factors that you need to take into account if you really want to do it in a quantitative fashion. And then a lot of videos turn out not to be suitable to do that kind of analysis. Yeah,
that makes sense. Thank you so much. I know Kevin Haggerty has a question for Jan. I don't know if he is here. Kevin, do you want to ask yourself?
I'm here. I don't know if you can. I could just read my read my question right off the little chart here. Where is it here? Anyway, I can't read it. Essentially, my question is about, I'm interested in the organizational reality of these different categories in Germany. So there's all kinds of questions about are they required officially to record culture, ethnicity, etc.? The Roma people prefer, that is their self-identified category. Why don't they use that category? If they did use that category, would it then become stigmatized? I'm just curious about sort of the day-to-day organizational practices and politics of some of these categories.
Yeah, let me first start to speak generally about like ethnic cultural categories in German policing, and then talk about the categorization of the Roma, because it is a kind of specific case. Like the use of these categories has been changing massively in German policing in the last 5-10 years, not at least because of the what happened in the US and the global Black Lives Matter movement. And it nowadays is kind of generally frowned upon to ever kind of refer to the ethnicity or cultural background of someone in official police correspondence. Like for instance, in their public relations work, they only mention the ethnicity of someone if it in some way relates to the crime. And even in their internal communication, they more or less try not to refer to ethnicity or culture. They rarely do it. They do it specifically when they talk about appearance of people. There they often use it. And in some, but this is more or less, and even in their internal, how's it called? Internal communications by wire, they are not allowed to say it out loud. But in their, if you go to the station, how police officers talk to each other internally, how they make sense of the world, there it's really important. They use all kind of very specific terms all the time to kind of understand what people they're dealing with. Like these categories of difference to understand the world. For instance, a term like young Arab people would be I heard it hundreds of times. Yeah, when it comes to the Roma, it's even kind of more difficult because Roma NGOs have pressured the police not to use any such designations for the last 10-20 years. Because they say as soon as a police officer kind of thinks as someone as being belonging to the Roma people, he will be criminalized. And therefore they don't want the police ever to use any of these terms. Yeah.
Okay,
I hope this answers the question.
Yeah.
It does. Okay, perfect. Then we will continue, and I'll give the next question to Dr. Keesman. Do factors like status or seniority or reputation of the officer impact how others may align with them or not? So, for example, would certain officers ignore signs from lower status rank officers, or do other social cues impact how these signals may be read or noticed? And I think this question is from Catherine Hancock.
That's a really good question. So I wasn't able to test such traits, but what I can say is that yes, seniority impacts it, but I would also argue actually that I do think that personality traits, I mean, there are some officers that are much more confident in the way that they act or take on leadership much more than others. So then it matters whether they indeed read signs or try to align more with their younger colleagues. So I would hypothesize that younger officers are much more trying to see what the other one is doing, because they're initially in a learning phase still in the beginning years. So they are much more still learning what types of signs are there even, and how can I align with so many different people, so many different colleagues, but also civilians, so that reading signs is much more integrated into their daily work than it is for senior officers who do a lot of things on habit as well. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's difficult. I also felt like it was difficult sometimes for more senior officers to reflect on the hows of doing things, because it becomes so ingrained in them, in their bodies, that they have a hard time making that explicit. And it's easier for younger officers to do that because they're still in a phase of learning all these signs in the method. So I can't say for sure.
Okay, thank you. The similar question actually came in for you, Jan, whether or not officers are using, whether or not it depends on lower status or higher status, younger or older officer, how they engage with the category Zigo, as you said. So I don't know if you can say something about that too.
Yeah, a good question. I think I would differentiate between the kind of the language and the knowledge practices on the station level and on police management level, even like on middle management, because as I more or less kind of described to Kevin earlier on like the middle management and top management level of the police, these they don't even think in these terms mostly. They don't use these categories. Like I think not, I would guess not even internally. For them, it's not very meaningful because they think of their whole approaches differently. But as I also said, like the police officers on station level, they use them constantly. But there it's also interesting how much is this changing in the last 5 to 10 years. Because nowadays, many police officers, especially the younger ones, could themselves be described as migrants. I now speak a little bit jargon-like, academic jargon-like, because like these for me, it's because I use only emic terms. I can't just call somebody a migrant any longer, because this is also a kind of an act of migrantization. Yeah. But for the police officers who are themselves migrants, for them, or with them entering the police in the last 10 years, the whole kind of interaction that stations have really changed, I think. And because it's not that it changed how you use these categories, because now they can also be used as a form of intercultural knowledge. Like, let's say a police officer with Turkish background, he can come in, he can say, okay, I know a lot about like kind of my people. And this is interesting because then these stereotypes kind of have some form of legitimacy. And it's also interesting that I think these younger people, younger police officers, and even the ones who don't have any migration background, they're very much open to reflect on their use of categories. And actually, with a lot of them, I talked about how, well, like, what are these terms that they're using? And many of them felt uncomfortable in the way, like, how their job experience had changed themselves, what kind of terms they began themselves to use, whether or not they are now the racists, which these were often kind of interesting discussions for me as a social anthropologist, because for us as social anthropologists, kind of figuring out how to represent otherness and how to talk about it is kind of the core of our profession. And in the way these younger police officers were struggling with very similar questions, which I found quite fascinating.
I'm going to jump in with my own question, and then I will take questions from the panel again. But as you're talking about this, I've done ethnographic work way back when, 20 years ago in Germany. And at that time, there was a different term that police officers were mostly using, and that was Kanaken, which is a derogatory term for mostly Turkish, Moroccan, and Albanian guest worker children, essentially. So I'm just wondering what happened with that term. Like, how do you explain that we're now moving to a different category, that police officers are potentially engaging more with the category of Zigos versus the category they used before? Is that related to migration patterns in the EU? Is that like, what are your thoughts on that?
Like the terms I was talking about are the specific terms used for like people who could be described as Roma people, and the term kind of Kanaken or whatever is also still around. But this specific term, for example, I have heard really rarely, because I think there has been a generational change, and now like everybody in Germany, like these younger police officers, they don't feel kind of comfortable in using such terms most of the time. But I think it becomes really interesting how these terms have changed. And I think there are many kind of imic terms that they use that still have some that are intertwined with cultural categories. For example, one of the main words they use is Asi, which kind of means a social, like people who kind of act not in social comfortable ways or something like this. But they often use it for a very specific group of people, but it's like for people who are mostly Turkish, Arabic young people. But I think it's more open, and like even this derogatory term has kind of become more deculturalized, or how you want to frame it. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I have a question for both of you from YouTube again, and that is the big sociological question: where's gender in your analysis? Does it play a role? It's for both of you. Maybe Laura, you can start.
Sure. I think I'll focus on the freeze. That's maybe a better one. So in terms of gender in the freezing experiences, I noticed first that freezing for, it's not as easy to talk about freezing for female police officers than it is for male officers. So this is a bit counterintuitive, maybe, that the assumption is maybe that female officers are more comfortable talking about their emotions and feelings and, you know, very lay people's understanding of gender, maybe. But it's actually the other way around. So female officers, at least in the Netherlands, are having to do a lot of effort to fit in the police organization, which is quite masculine. So they generally adopt a very masculine way of acting. This is a bit, this is not so nuanced as I'm putting it now. But so for female officers, I felt it was a bit difficult to admit any sort of those experiences. But I cannot say, because I didn't count it, if it happens more to male or female officers. So I can't make a statement that it happens more to what type of officers. I didn't run that analysis. Also because it's difficult to make it quantitative, because it is a topic that is rarely talked about. So it's difficult anyhow to get officers to talk about these types of experiences, although they do gossip about it amongst themselves. But this is another layer of meaning, right? So I can't really make a harsh statement about how gender really plays a role in when it happens or how it happens. But the similarities of their experiences and stories are striking. So it's a similar way of experiencing for both. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And Jan.
Yeah, gender has become way more central in my attempts to understand these police practices, because like when we started out we kind of focused on this race, ethnicity, culture question, and this was kind of the category that we actually wanted to, that we got funded for to explore. But the longer we studied policing, the more and more apparent it became that this does not really work, because when the police officers act, they use various categories that they're actually in practice difficult to kind of analytically sort out, but they all play a role, and gender is massive and is central there. Because as I said, for them a problem are young Arabic men, and there you have gender already in part of it. And if they talk of Aussies, for example, Aussies are always men. It's kind of and also there's also age, which is also central, and I think always hidden in all these things is always class, which nobody ever reflects upon, openly reflects on and speaks about, but I think it's always there and kind of also determines police practice a lot, especially because police action in Germany depends a lot on whether or not the citizen is able to complain against what you have done, in the various forms that you can do. And I think here class is kind of central, because many people, the police officers, know that if you are poor and don't have good networks, you will not be able to really substantially complain against police action. And this kind of determines their whole kind of the potential of how they can intervene.
Yeah. And I mean, especially in German society, where class is so built into society anyways, with the school system and all these other aspects and institutions. My children's teachers actually refer to the kids who go to the lowest streamed school, the Mittelschule, as Assis. So as my kids are in a higher streamed school. So the class is built in throughout. Anyhow, let's move on from that. And Laura, a question for you from Dr. Green on YouTube. And she's saying, thank you for these excellent talks. Dr. Keesman, she's referring to you as doctor again. You have an opportunity to hear whether and how officers might distinguish between police aggression, just force versus excessive violence. And for the listeners on YouTube, Laura is not yet done with her PhD, but I'm sure it's well on its way.
It's on its way. Yeah, I saw the question in the chat, but now I can't seem to find it anymore.
So basically, she's asking how they distinguish between justified force and excessive violence.
Yeah. This is also very difficult. I mean, it's basically also what Jan said, that it's very dynamic. So I would even go as far as saying it depends on the type of situation, on the type of acts, when they choose which wording. So to them, indeed, it is not a fixed category that is always the same in that sense, although there is a definition, certainly also in the police organization, but the way that they use it, I mean, this relates very much to what Jan is presented about. The way that they use it is very dynamic. So it's making that distinction between excessive, I mean, they know the extreme, they know what extreme behaviors are and when it is excessive, but they also view that violence is part of their occupation. It's violence is in a sense part of the monopoly that they have. I think I froze. I'm pretty sure.
You did, but it caught up, so it's all good.
Okay. It depends. That's a bit of an odd answer actually as a scholar, but still, it depends.
Well, I mean, sometimes it does depend in many dynamic situations.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jan, I'm going to give you, I think we're going to make this the last question because we've gone quite a long time with the Q&A because so many questions came in. So that's excellent for the first panel of the day. It's been a great one. So this question is from Dr. Urbanik, and she says, thank you for your presentation. I really appreciated you added critical nuance to the concept of racial and ethnic and other categories in police work. I recognize that you claim that even when these categories are evoked, they do not influence the outcome of the interaction. Here, I think you were purely speaking to the legal outcome. So for example, arrest, charges, etc. I'm hoping you can share if these categories may affect non-legal outcomes. So for example, experiences of stigma, procedural justice, and so on. That's a big question.
Yeah. To make clear, like I was speaking about very specific interactions. Like I think there are also other interactions where culture, ethnicity, and race play a major role. And like I was talking about this one interaction and many others where they don't. But I think you can kind of carefully differentiate. And I think I will take a question and speak again about this specific interaction, what happened afterwards, which was kind of interesting. Because like the problem of my kind of research is always that you only have kind of really good access to the perspectives of the police officer and not to the perspective of the people who are being policed. And actually like in my recent project, we try to change this. We try to have one researcher following the police officer, the other following the person who's policed, and then you get kind of then you can with this material I can probably much better answer your question because these kind of perceptions because the people who are being policed often perceive racial bias, like they are very kind of totally different from what the police officers think what they have done. But to go back to like this specific interaction between the police officers and Marco in the end, while I as an observer thought that they were kind of a little bit harsh with how they treated Marco. Marco spoke very was very thankful towards the police. He told them later on that he felt very much respected, that in Germany the police would always be fair and would be good to him, and that that they could be kind of go out as friends. And I think this has a lot to do with Marco's experience of German police and of other police forces, because in Bulgaria and in Romania, if they can treat you as a Romani, they will probably treat you worse. And for him, like he also had a kind of very relational understanding of police in a way. Yeah. And interesting enough, the police officer later met Marco's son at a train station, and they just colloquially chatted about what had happened and how his father now and so on. So while it's still difficult because I don't have my research is very much about the perspective of the police officers, I think in this case I would guess that the citizen didn't feel discriminated against. Yeah.
Okay, so much. Thank you, both of you, for a truly fantastic panel. For another 20 minutes here with the questions. Thank you so much for insightful presentations. Laura, we are especially happy to have you in Edmonton the next couple of weeks. And I am looking forward to seeing many of you in our next panel, which will be at 8:40 a.m. Mountain Time and later in the day for those of you joining us from the rest of the world. And that panel will be on citizen views and interactions. We're hoping to seeing many of you back then. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.